Jessia, is that how I say your name? Sorry. Okay, well, I'll do the introductions for this panel on Arctic governance, panel 5. So Jessia Chabayo, graduate student in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. Her thesis is comparing Canada's role on the United Nations Security Council and the Arctic Council, finding several roles. She is interested in international relations and Canadian foreign and security policy. She chose to do her thesis on the middle power because she was interested in looking at Canada's role on international organizations like United Nations Security Council and the Arctic Council. Her thesis compares Canada's role as a non-permanent member on the UNSC and as an Arctic state on the Arctic Council. Kara Kat Hodson is currently a PhD candidate and research fellow at UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, based in the Arctic capital of Tromsø. Her background is in political science and Russian area studies. Her areas of interest are Arctic governance and security. Her current projects involve security of the Russian Arctic and Pan-Arctic regional governance institutions, such as the Arctic Mayors Forum. Christopher Chiasa holds an MA in political science from American University with particular emphasis on Arctic defense, environmental policy, and marine ecosystems. As an emergent Arctic scholar, Christopher excels in using an interdisciplinary research approach to inform his work. He has published his work in numerous academic journals, notably with the Arctic Yearbook, University of Lapland, and Georgetown. Professionally, Christopher has held roles in open source intelligence and policy analysis. So these are some excellent thinkers in Arctic governance, and they have been engaged in researching Arctic governance and other systems of international Arctic affairs. So I'd like to give the mic to Jessia. Jessia, I'm sorry I'm not saying your name properly, and if she can give us some further insights into her research and her main interest.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessia Cabello, and I will be presenting on my thesis. So I was a graduate studies doing my Master's of Arts at the University of Manitoba, and I graduated last June, and then I defended my thesis last January, and so I will be doing my presentation on my thesis. Yes, and then so I'm just going to pull up the PowerPoint here. Yeah, and then can you see my presentation PowerPoint? Yeah, and then so hello everyone. I will be presenting on my thesis, comparing Canada's role on the United Nations Security Council and the Arctic Council, finding several roles. So the problem that my thesis addressed is that in Canadian foreign policy literature, there has been an ongoing debate about Canada's role in the world and whether Canada is the leader, middle power, or placeholder. A leader creates new ideas and norms on international organizations. Paul Gasalowski would call them norm or policy entrepreneurs. And so it is important to note that being a leader is not being the same as being a great power. Middle powers are the helpful fixers of the great powers, and Adam Chapnick has written on Canada as a middle power. Placeholders occupy seats on international organizations and vote, but they do not have any decision-making powers. Being a placeholder also ties into Canada's role as a middle power because there is a debate in the Canadian foreign policy literature about whether Canada is a middle power in decline or whether the middle power is a myth. And Andrew Cohen and Adam Chapnick has written on Canada's decline, or that the idea that Canada is a middle power is a myth. And Canada is usually assumed to play a middle power or a placeholder role, but rarely does the Canadian foreign policy literature considers Canada as a leader, given that it is an Arctic state on the Arctic Council. And the usual comparison is Canada's role in NATO and the United Nations Security Council, especially when it's involved in peacekeeping missions. And so what if we compared Canada an organization that includes the P5, but Canada has different roles? And so the research question for my thesis is, what is Canada's role on the United Nations Security Council and the Arctic Council? Does it lead ideas? Is it the helpful fixer middle power? Or does it simply serve as a placeholder? And furthermore, how are Canada's role on the United Nations Security Council similar or different, given that all of the P5 members are present in both organizations, but they have different voting roles? And so my thesis seeks to fill in the gap in the research on the middle power theory. So John English and Danica Burke has written on the Arctic Council and Canada as an Arctic state on the Arctic Council. And then Adam Chapnick has written on Canada as a non-permanent member on the United Nations Security Council. But the literature has not compared and contrasted Canada on both organizations. And so my thesis is also a test of the middle power theory and whether the assumption that Canada is a middle power holds. And it is also important now with the return of the great power competition. And it is also the first time that Canada's roles on the Arctic Council is pulled, and all of the 6 terms as Canada as a non-permanent member on the United Nations Security Council is looked at. And so the theories explored in my thesis is, the main one is the middle power theory, which is the idea that Canada is a helpful fixer of the Western P5 members. And the 2 related ideas on the middle power theory is internationalism and multilateralism. So internationalism is the willingness to be involved in the world, and multilateralism is the idea of joining international organizations. And so the table here shows the methodology of my research. And so this compares Canada on the United Nations Security Council and the Arctic Council. So the United Nations Security Council has the permanent 5 members and 10 elected non-permanent members. And then on the Arctic Council, we have 8 Arctic states, 6 permanent participants, and 13 non-Arctic states or observers. And then on the United Nations Security Council, we have the permanent 5 who have the power of veto. And then on the Arctic Council, you have the 8 Arctic states who have a veto power, because on the Arctic Council, decisions are taken by consensus among the 8 Arctic states. But on the United Nations Security Council, a veto by the P5 would mean that there's no decision made. But what the chart shows here is that on the United Nations, that Canada has the opportunity to play the role of a leader on both organizations and also on the United Nations Security Council as well, because when 9 out of the 15 votes are needed for a resolution to pass on the United Nations Security Council, Canada can outvote the permanent 5 members. And just like on the Arctic Council, Canada's vote does matter on both organizations. And then the findings for Canada on the United Nations Security Council. So Canada's role was mixed, and Canada played the role of a middle power placeholder and leader as a non-permanent member on the United Nations Security Council. And then for the Arctic Council, Canada played the role of a leader on the Arctic Council during its first and second chairship. For example, Canada created the Arctic Council in 1996. It created the Economic Council in 2014. Canada was instrumental in establishing the roles of observers, and Canada vetoed the European observer membership due to the steel fishing ban. And so the implications of my research is that when you look at Canada's roles on both the Arctic Council and the United Nations Security Council, it shows that Canada can play a lead role, which is often looked by the literature, which assumes that Canada only plays the role of a middle power or a placeholder. But sometimes being in a placeholder role for Canada might be helpful, especially when one of the great powers or when the great powers have dominated the voting process on international organizations. And so that includes my presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So next, we'll move on to Kara with her presentation, and then we'll follow up by Christopher. So they have 15 minutes each, and then we'll open to questions and answers. Go ahead, Kat.
Thank you. Desire, can I ask you to please stop sharing your screen?
Okay, got sure. Okay.
Thank you. All right, so let me get mine up here. All right. Can everybody see it? Okay, so my starting point is that the Arctic Council is a very well established and very legitimate actor in Arctic governance, but it's not the only player in town. And so that is kind of what is fascinating to me, is looking at the constellation of other actors that are also. And then I did want to just kind of begin with a quick introduction to myself and why I feel like I have a little bit of knowledge to share. I do have quite a background in both political science and in Russian area studies, focusing specifically on the Arctic and Pan-Arctic region. But here today, I'm just going to talk first of all about the idea of governance and global governance, because as I'm sure most of us are aware, above the national level, there is no government. So everything we do is a matter of soft power. And I begin from the standard, I guess you could say, the canonical definition of global governance, which was published in 1995 with the Commission on Global Governance. I won't read it out to you because it's just a lot of words, but basically it's talking about how we structure relations in the absence of some sort of form of enforcement, and why we all just want to be good neighbors most of the time. So speaking specifically about Arctic governance, there are, like I said, there are a plethora of actors. The Arctic Council is pretty much the go-to that you think of when you first think of Arctic governance, but there are actually a lot of other actors. You have UN-related actors such as the International Maritime Organization. You have Indigenous peoples organizations. You have sub-regional, Arctic regional, so like the Barents Euro-Arctic Council. And then you have the one that I like to focus on, or the one that I am focusing on currently, which is the Arctic Mayors Forum. Now, if you'll notice down in the left-hand corner, you see the Arctic Mayors Forum logo, but right next to it, you also see the Northern Forum logo. The Arctic Mayors Forum is new. It was established in 2019, and it just got its secretariat up and running this past winter, right here where I'm at in Tromsø in Norway. But it is not the first iteration of its kind. The first is the Northern Forum, which for a variety of reasons didn't quite live up to expectations. It does still exist, but it is currently based in the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia in Russia. So now more than ever, it is kind of a sidelined venue. But so the Arctic Mayors Forum, like I said, established in 2019. It currently has 16 member municipalities. It has, let me really quickly go through. It has, give me 1 second, sorry, technical difficulties. There we go. Okay, so right here in Norway, it does have 3 municipalities that are members. In Finland, it has 4. In Sweden and in Greenland, they both have 2. And in the US, and surprisingly in Canada, there is only 1. But membership is always evolving and ongoing, so it is a flexible term. Before February 24th, 2022, there were 2 municipalities in Russia that were observers, but that has since fallen by the wayside again for the obvious reasons. But mostly what the Arctic Mayors Forum was created for is encapsulated in this quote that's actually from their mission statements and their founding document, which is that the current Arctic governance system offers no formalized and structured procedure for local communities to be involved on a continuous basis in Arctic policy decision-making processes. And what that means is that basically, when we talk about Arctic governance, it is assumed that local level or municipal level voices will be represented through the national voice, which, as I'm pretty sure we're aware, national interests and local interests can often diverge, especially when it comes to issues of geopolitical interest or natural resource extraction. There are any number of examples we can talk about that where there is a disconnect between what the capitals want and what those on the ground are looking for. And you might say, well, Kat, there's also the Indigenous peoples organizations, which is true. And they have, they have an impressive level of organization and an impressive platform, especially within the Arctic Council, to make what you could say a version of Arctic voices represented. But if you're not an Indigenous member, or if you're not a member of an Indigenous group, you're subsumed. Your voice is subsumed under the national level. So that is why the Arctic Mayors Forum felt that it was necessary to have actual Arctic cities and towns and villages have a seat at the table. Now, it is also important to mention that because it is so new, it does seek an observer status on the Arctic Council, but it does not have one yet. That is not stopping them because they started in 2019. They actually cut their teeth at a very interesting time, because right in 2020, we had the coronavirus pandemic. And so luckily, they were all able to meet virtually and discuss what was going on in their communities and how they were dealing with it and how it was impacting lives in different Arctic contexts around the world. And so the Arctic Mayors Forum, whether or not it gets a seat in the Arctic Council, is actually positioned to either be a springboard for local voices at the international level, or it can also just be horizontal knowledge sharing across national boundaries. Part of the joy and the frustration of the Arctic Mayors Forum is that there's so much potential, but not much that has had a chance to really grow yet in this way. Now that I've said all that, I will kind of turn back towards the theory that municipal level involvement in international level governance is actually it's a well-established tradition, and the Arctic Mayors Forum is just one of many instances of municipalities engaging internationally. And depending on the discipline that you're in, it goes by a variety of different names. If you're in public administration, it's known most commonly as international local cooperation. In IR, it can be called modern city diplomacy. It can also be called paradiplomacy, which has mostly referred to subnational states and provinces and regions, not so much municipalities, but there's nothing in the definition that says that it can't. And then in political geography, it's most commonly referred to as translocal relations. And there is quite a plethora of examples of this actually occurring throughout the world with this kind of springboarding or boomeranging or scale jumping. We have lots of fun terms for all these at different levels. And so when we talk about non-state actors, what we are basically talking about is their ability to influence, right? Josiah was just talking about how Canada has voting power. Non-state actors don't have that, so they really have to really advocate for their positions via the ability to influence. And so when I'm looking at specifically with the case of the Arctic Mayors Forum, I'm looking at two levels of potential influence. The first is participation, which is having the seat at the table, being able to expend resources on projects that are important. And then there is influence, which is actually changing the mind or the decision of somebody with the power to do so in the way that is favorable to them. Again, it's still very early on with the Arctic Mayors Forum, so this is a future potential development that has yet to really have much impact, but this is a very fascinating avenue that I'm looking at in my research going forward. And there has been a lot of literature that has talked about how non-state actors can influence specifically in Arctic governance. Unsurprisingly, Indigenous peoples organizations, not least because they occupy a very unique position that is, to the best of my knowledge, not present in any other international forum, which is that they do have that permanent participant position. Intergovernmental organizations and non-governmental organizations, the private sector, scientific communities, these have all been studied. But again, what's fascinating is that because there hasn't been municipal level representation, it hasn't been studied yet. So in a nutshell, that is kind of what I am looking into, and just have a lot of hopes for the future about. So that is my presentation, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, we'll move on to Christopher, and then we'll put questions after all the presenters. So Christopher, do you mind taking on your presentation?
Of course. Thank you very much, and wonderful job by Kat and Josiah. Okay, I'm sharing my screen very briefly here. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. So today I'm going to be talking about the defense dimensions of the Arctic Council, in particular to navigating the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route amid climate change. So a brief introduction: with climate change rapidly melting ice in the region, States are moving to claim critical strategic tools to expedite resource extraction, navigate national security, and shorten maritime transportation routes. The Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route are claimed by Canada and Russia respectively as their own historic national waters. And the current state of the Arctic Council indicates that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has fundamentally changed the ability of the Arctic Council to act as a cooperative body that brings together Arctic nations. There is this very much break after the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And instead here, what we are seeing is that geopolitical threats have securitized and politicized the Council into a NATO-Russia competition where trust is melting as quickly as ice, frankly. And this has raised tensions and created a unique challenge for the Arctic Council to stabilize and return to a body that is focused on environmental protection of the Arctic, indigenous peoples, cooperation with nation states, and a environment where there is a lack of politicization. But the recent accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO has only inflamed this tension and has created a very unique challenge. And so I'm trying to see what the role of the Arctic Council is in navigating the geopolitics of the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route is going to be in the future. And to what degree can the Arctic Council remain independent of external conflicts? So a little bit about the Northern Sea Route here. As you can see in red, it extends from the Bering Sea, where the dot is around Andar in Russia, all the way across towards the GUIK, which is the Greenland, Iceland, and UK gap, which is a strategic gap that allows transportation to come across from the coast of Russia all the way out into the Norwegian Sea. The route makes travel time between Europe and Asia roughly about 3,000 miles shorter, 11 days quicker than a southern transit via the Strait of Malacca and Suez Canal. The Suez Canal and the Strait of Malacca are heavily trafficked, and having the ability to travel through the Northern Sea Route or the Northwest Passage will be an immense opportunity both for Asian markets and European markets to connect. Again, here at the Northern Sea Route, core Russian economic and security interests are aspects of national identity, and they're at stake in and around the Northern Sea Route. The Northern Sea Route is a very much Russian entity and identity, and the Russians are willing to do anything that it takes to protect their national identity. Economically, 1/5 of Russia's gross domestic product and over 30% of government revenue comes from the Arctic. And so the Russian government is focused on enforcing control over activities of foreign navies in the waters of the Northern Sea Route in order to maintain that economic and geopolitical control over the area that they occupy. In addition, Russia claims that the Northern Sea Route are internal waters and therefore not open to freedom of navigation operations, which the US likes to practice often in adversarial territory or international waters, as they like to call it. Under Article 234 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, ice clause is what Russia claims its internal waters are. Moving on here, the Northwest Passage is also another interesting route. And Canada claims it on the historical Inuit use of waters and legal agreements from past cases in the International Court of Justice. But the US contends that claim, basing it as an international state. And the treaty is accepted as international law, but it was never ratified by the US Congress. It also considers that the Northwest Passage is an international state under UN Close Article 37, as seen as a body of two large bodies of water connecting to larger bodies of water. So that definition has its sort of loophole in where the US comes and says, okay, this is an international strait rather than internal Canadian waters. An international strait designation is usually when significant traffic transits the strait, but current traffic volume is low at the time, and it's expected to increase as ice melts. And this is where climate change really comes into play here. As sea ice extent minimums continue to see record lows and ice continues to melt and waters continue to warm, there is a higher level of confrontation, either accidental or purposeful, when it comes to warships, cargo ships, or transit vessels as they're transiting through the Northwest Passage or the Northern Sea Route, which raises tensions in the region and creates security incidents that are waiting to happen initially. And so the implications of this international strait framework say that Canada can regulate most aspects of traffic in the passage, but they can't prohibit or restrict international shipping traffic. And so this also has a geoeconomic aspect as well, which is highly contentious among the 7 other Arctic states. And so here's a short video from Jens Stoltenberg, which is the NATO Secretary General, speaking about the Arctic and the threat it holds. And so you can see there, 7 out of the 8 members of the Arctic Council are NATO members, which holds an incredible weight in antagonizing Russia and raising tensions among the Council, bringing in matters that are supposed to be external to the Council and not within its mandate at all into the Council, whether they like it or not. And so this brings us to a little bit of military activity in the Arctic. So a study that I had conducted using data from the Center for Strategic and International Studies is that the reported military exercises between September of 2020 and March 2023 have ebbed and flowed at a very interesting rate. You can see here, for example, in March of 2021 and April of 2021, you have incredibly high sort of exercises. So there's a lot of military activity from the reported drills that are occurring. And these include flyovers, missile launches, joint exercises, infrastructure exercises, etc. But as you can see here, it reached its height before the invasion. And then once the invasion happened in February of 2022, you see a dip in military activity when it comes to drills and exercises. And so this can be explained by the toll that external activities such as the war in Ukraine are taking on both NATO and Russia. And so here we return to the Arctic Council. It's the leading intergovernmental forum promoting cooperation, coordination, and interaction among the Arctic states, indigenous peoples, and other Arctic inhabitants on common Arctic issues, and in particular, issues of sustainable development and Arctic environmental protection. This is from the Arctic Council's first declaration in 1996. And so, returning to original questions here, what is then the role of the Arctic Council in navigating the geopolitics of the Northwest Passage and Northern Sea Route? Continuing to act as a high forum for discussion on environmental protection of the Arctic and maintaining scientific cooperation on mineral resources, search and rescue, and interdisciplinary Arctic research is essential for the Arctic Council in the Northwest Passage and Northern Sea Route. There must be a depoliticization of the Arctic Council, and rather the body must remain as a unified organization to protect the Arctic environment, not as a political organization that punishes actors for external events that have nothing to do with the Council itself. Now, the next question, to what degree can the Arctic Council remain independent of external conflicts? Obviously, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's very, very difficult. The degree to which that the Arctic Council can remain independent of these external conflicts depends on the commitment of its member states to prioritize Arctic cooperation and maintain the Council's non-militarized and cooperative nature. And as the current state, it's not been able to remain independent. It's rather letting geopolitics and military security corrupt its progress for the foreseeable future. Cooperation, diplomatic interaction, research, scientific data sharing, and interdisciplinary work with Russia must resume at the previous level if the Arctic Council is to continue as its mandate had set out. And so in conclusion, the three primary findings is that depoliticization and cooperation must occur in order for the Arctic Council to maintain its effectiveness. It should strive to depoliticize its decision-making process and focus on cooperative efforts among member states, ensuring that the Council remains as a unified organization with a shared goal of protecting the Arctic environment is essential. Scientific research and data sharing is a low-hanging fruit in which member states can cooperate on low-stakes objectives and encourage data sharing and research collaboration that can lead to better understanding and informed decision-making for the region's challenges. And finally, prioritizing Arctic cooperation despite states' behaviors and maintaining the Council's non-militarized and cooperative approach. The goal is not for the Council to be used as a political tool, but as an arena for environmental innovation and leadership. The Council's purpose is to promote cooperation as a high forum among Arctic member states and protect the Arctic environment first and foremost. It is not a military nor security body. That is left up to other bodies like NATO, like the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, like the Security Council, that hold those objectives and mandates and decision-making processes. Thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to your questions. At the end here, you can scan the QR code for my LinkedIn, and my contact information is below.